Welcome. This is Vincent Price, here with another tale to tickle your terror bone. Tonight's tale is a little unusual. It's the story of a man and a deal. The Bookseller and the Devil by Brent Beebe. Once upon a time there lived a kindly bookseller named Jedediah. He was a good man, very kind, perhaps a bit too kind, as some of his neighbors would have said if you had asked them. Still, even these neighbors liked him and especially felt pity for him, as he was frequently the target of a gang of ruffians. For some odd reason, they were of the impression that he was a wealthy man, and therefore might be forced to part with some of his riches. However, the truth was, while he was the owner of several expensive volumes, he was not the greatest of businessmen, as he often bought more than he sold. And as for these volumes of rare, sometimes priceless texts, he had never managed to sell a one. But he was unable to convince said ruffians of this, and so often found his shop under threat of vandalism if he did not pay protection. But he never did, partially indeed due to his poverty, however also due to his pride. He knew if he were to give in to their demands, he would forever be their slave. And so Jedediah sought assistance in the usual place, the police. But it was for naught, as not only did this gang mask themselves when descending upon his shop, the police did not seem that interested in his problem. He was a low priority in a neighborhood of foul deeds. And so for some time Jedediah suffered under their wrath. He spent many a day, his shop shuttered, as he set about righting the wrongs of their mischief. But then the day came when he was given a final option: pay them or find his livelihood burned to the ground. This was, as had been before many a man, the final straw for Jedediah. Now, it must be stated once again that Jedediah was a good man. He was not an avid worshipper of the church, but he was what was known as a God-fearing man. In fact, he often found himself in prayer, begging God for deliverance of his suffering, a position found in by many a desperate man. And each time, he was answered with silence. And so, this is what led Jedediah to selling his soul to the devil. Some time ago, when Jedediah was much younger, he came into a most interesting text, the Necronomicon. How that occurred is not important as much as the contents of the book, a ritual that would conjure the devil himself. Now, as was said before, the bookseller was a God-fearing man. However, desperation had driven him to the point of despair. And so, a few days following the threat of arson, Jedediah cracked open that ancient, unholy text and read aloud the passage.
You called Jedediah?
In a flash of light and smoke, a singular being now stood before him. He was not what the shopkeeper expected: a tall, pale man dressed in a suit of deep blue. Jedediah began to wonder if this was, in fact, only a dream. Satan?
Satan was detained. I was sent in his place. Do not worry, I am more than capable of assistance.
Oh, my.
Don't be afraid. Fear is useless. Just tell me what you wish.
They're threatening to burn my store. It's all I have. The being stood unmoved. Jedediah began to wonder if he had not made himself clear when it smiled.
And you're willing to accept the price?
Jedediah lowered his head. Yes.
Done.
Jedediah looked up, and the being was gone. Perhaps it was all a dream after all. After that, dream or not, life began to change for Jedediah. His shop never burned. He'd read in the paper some new police commissioner vowing to clean up the neighborhood, so perhaps that was why the criminals who had threatened never made good on their promise. In truth, the neighborhood did appear to prosper in some ways. However, despite the old saying that time heals all wounds, it appears that time had not yet come for the area. But for now, Jedediah was content, and yet, still in the back of his thoughts, he wondered if any of it had been true. The book had seemingly vanished from sight. Perhaps it was just. But Jedediah was not a man to let things lie. He knew if it did happen, he would one day be called for by the man, or even Satan himself, to take his place among the damned. He thought perhaps confession might rid him of the obscene agreement, but he knew that any priest would consider him nothing more than an insane man. And so he knew only one other way to save himself from the pits of hell. He sold his bookstore. You'd be surprised how much New York real estate goes for these days, and used the money to better the lives of those he lived amongst. He helped the uneducated, the homeless, and the starving. He told those he helped to not tell anyone of his deeds. He thought recognition would perhaps negate any of these good deeds in the eyes of God. He gave and he gave until one day he only had enough for himself to live out the remaining years in marginal comfort. And yet he did not cease until the day he found himself unable to rise from his bed. He thought of calling a doctor, but something in him told him it was of no use. He would be dead before the end of the day, and so he waited. He awoke, not having remembered falling asleep in the first place. He looked down at the foot of his bed to see the man from so many years ago. He wore the same sharp suit of deep blue, his visage still a pale white. He neither smiled nor frowned at Jedediah as his fearless gaze bore down upon him.
Jedediah, are you ready?
The man's voice held no contempt for Jedediah, and yet this was hardly of comfort to him. I thought perhaps because of the things I did. The man shook his head.
A deal is a deal.
He stretched out his hand, which Jedediah was compelled to take.
Come.
All perceptions of the room vanished about him. Jedediah could feel the world fold under, rush past him like an unstoppable tide. And then, all was still. He flinched, expecting to feel the scorching heat of hell's fire lashing out at his withered frame. But there were no flames, no heat, no pain. He opened his eyes. A garden of blue sky and billowed clouds lay before him in every direction. A gentle wind encircled him, body and soul. He turned to see the man standing beside in silence. The man smiled as he gestured to a majestic gate lying before them. Jedediah had sold his soul to heaven.